Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, as you know, during these history hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great work being done by scholars who have used the historical collections held in the Hagley Library, especially folks who have received support in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joins me today. Jacob Bruggeman is a PhD candidate at Johns Hopkins University. Jacob, thanks for speaking with me today.
Thanks for having me on.
Oh, you're welcome. Let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it you're researching and writing about?
I am in the process of wrapping up a dissertation on how computer hackers, telephone hackers, and other groups on the margins of big technological systems in mid-century America moved from those margins, from places that were policed by corporate security squads, perhaps of Ma Bell, Ma Bell's era, or maybe more recently, in some papers I was looking at the Hagley, MCI security teams, how they moved from those areas policed by corporations and different federal agencies to, by the 1990s, the center of, and 2000s, the centers of power and organization in the sort of technological infrastructure, corporate space, so on and so forth, that would come to govern cyberspace. And so it's a history tracing both the movement of hackers from the margins of these systems to the center, and also the changing political commitments of hackers themselves across the decades traced in the dissertation.
That seems like a really prescient and relevant topic to be researching at the moment.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll hope people buy the book. Hopefully, early listeners will circle back 2 years from now or whenever it is and grab a copy.
Well, I have no doubt. Now, who are these hackers you're talking about, and what kind of activities are they doing initially on the margins of these corporate systems?
So the folks I start with are in some ways familiar to your general, sort of informed American, perhaps. These are tinkerers in the Bay Area, in part who go on to, found companies like Apple, right? These are phone phreakers like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, to make the point more explicit, who in college built and sold multi-frequencing devices known as blue boxes, which gave them free access to Ma Bell's long distance telephone lines. Those are a very small group of the people I look at, and they may be familiar to people who know the history of Silicon Valley or who've watched certain, shows or movies about the history of computing, or maybe if they're into this niche field, the history of hackers. The people that I'm more interested in are political hackers. So at the same time as Jobs and Wozniak are selling blue boxes in their dormitory at Berkeley, you have new left groups like the Youth International Party appropriating the first form of hacking, arguably telephone hacking, which is known as phone phreaking in the lingo of the late 60s and early 70s. And they're appropriating that technology and those techniques and connecting it to critiques of the Vietnam War, the American state, American technology, what they saw as the sort of hubris of high technological progress in an era that was marked by Vietnam, racial discrimination, so on and so forth. I'm looking at those people. And I'm also looking at everyday users who are maybe not necessarily tied in with the sort of activist left or the sort of tinkerer uh, college setting, which is a bit more familiar in the historiography and in the literature that's been kind of written on these subjects. So I'm looking at those groups, and early on, they're manufacturing equipment on their own. They're publishing newsletters, oftentimes from a basement or an office, sharing information with one another, building communities of enthusiasts that share interests in these technological systems, be it the telephone or microcomputing, so on and so forth. And between those three groups, you see movement across the decades that will follow. And some of them lose a political hard edge over time. For some of them, the political edge um, kind of dulls on the left critique of the system and becomes something of a right-wing critique of the system. Other people withdraw from politics entirely. Other people sell out. So there's a multiple outcomes for the people that are traced. But it's kind of between all those that we see still this movement into the system.
For those of us ignorant of the practice, could you explain what phone phreaking is?
So phone phreaking is a practice that is still around, but it's definitely not in the same form as it was in the period I'm talking about in the 60s and 70s. So in the 60s and 70s, in the US, but also elsewhere, large telephone providers, companies. In the US, this is AT&T, also known as Ma Bell or the Bell system, this conglomerate of a sort of big corporate entity known as AT&T with regional operating companies operating across the United States with a manufacturing arm known as Western Electric, which manufactured a lot of those phones that would be deployed in the operating companies, and a research division, Bell Labs. And in that massive system, engineers and executives began to realize that as America was suburbanizing, as population was growing, people were making more telephone calls, right? The war had ended. Maybe Johnny Smith's going off to college and he's calling home more regularly, X, Y, or Z. The volume was just increasing at a pace that the what had been the system, the technological system of routing long distance calls with human operators, right? So this is the era when computers were women, right? So there's a lot of interesting literature on this, right? But most of the infrastructure of calls being routed across the country was done by um, operators rerouting the calls physically with plugs and switches. Engineers and executives just realized this would not be feasible. In fact, there's some people who joke that and predicted that every American would need to be a telephone operator if we were going to stay in that system. And so they began to switch to a digital system, which was in kind of brief terms, using instead of the rotary dial push buttons connected to specific multi-frequency tones that through the tones themselves would kind of route through the system, right? So there would be an automated, is what the phrase was, automated switching network. And as the Bell system began to roll this out, the Bell system was a monopoly. So it wasn't really concerned in the way that a Microsoft or Google is today with trade secrets. It was publicizing the things it was doing very openly. And so in journals like the Bell System Technical Journal, in advertisements, it was openly describing the technology it would be using to create this new automated switching network. In other words, it was kind of giving away the keys to the kingdom in readily available public sort of records. And as people on college campuses or otherwise like interested electronics tinkerer types, which is a very kind of common activity in post-war America, as they got their hands on these guides to using this new automated switching network, they began to experiment with it. And there are a variety of ways that people begin to experiment with it. Some people, it's making actual physical modifications to a payphone or a phone in your home. These were big no-nos. It's unclear how often the Bell system or its security forces or even it's sort of like, customer service reps who'd go door to door, how often they would notice and enforce or police when they saw, physical alterations to their equipment. But it was happening. And so it started that way. And then eventually, as people began in these enthusiast communities to share information with one another, more advanced techniques developed. And some of them were the creation of some of the most notable techniques were the creation of these devices called blue boxes, red boxes, mute boxes. There's at least a dozen other colors of boxes that were used, which basically manipulated the automated through tones that you would play into a telephone to its receiver. It would manipulate the long distance network. And the blue box is the most famous of those. It mimicked all of the tones that the touch tone keypad had, and in that way could give you access to the long distance trunk lines. But there were other devices people were using to prevent you from from being billed on a long distance call to yeah, there's a variety of interesting techniques that were being used, but the most notable was the blue box. And this spread throughout the 60s and 70s. It blew up as media coverage on the subject swelled, and there's a famous 1971 Esquire article, which kind of popularized the idea of blue boxing. And it changed with the technological changes of the 70s and 80s. It's still a practice that's with us today, but it's one that's changed with digital telephony. And it's much more advanced, and you really have to be a hardcore hacker to be into phone phreaking today.
Well, how did that kind of activity come to have political valence? Perhaps especially initially from a leftist perspective.
Yeah, so in the late 60s, there's a chaotic and but promising set of developments on the American left, right? The 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago is sort of the paradigmatic example of this chaos, right? You have all this chaos with Johnson, uncertainty about the candidates. There's been a number in this election cycle of comparisons to Chicago 68, going in with some of the uncertainty. And in that sort of chaotic moment, there was a group of provocateurs, some would say, or others would say activists on the New Left, known as the Youth International Party, led by people like Abby Hoffman or Jerry Rubin, Anita Hoffman. And these are basically folks who there's literature on this. I'm trying to think of Thomas Frank's Conquest of Cool, Sam Brinkley Getting Loose. A lot of literature on the consumerism of the New Left, right, and the countercultural valences. People who believe that politics, formal politics, was somewhat overrated. That you needed to resist the system through lifestyle and aesthetic choices. And in this chaotic 1968 Chicago street and cityscape, the yippies come together and they run a pig for president. They're doing a number of pranks, right, to get media attention, so on and so forth. And in the midst of all that, Hoffman begins working with others, and he'd written this book called he'd written a manifesto and basically ripping off the system. I think it's called Revolution for the Hell of It. And there's other writings he has at the time, and there's a large section in there about making phone calls for free. So he's interested in basically giving people the tools to live the revolution, to kind of screw the system by your very actions in the world. And phone phreaking, because it's getting more media attention, it's just kind of a sexy new thing, right? In some ways, attracts his attention. And with a Cornell graduate student, I believe, Al Bell, he co-founds this journal, the Youth International Party Line, in 1971, so a few years later. And in that, they synthesize phone phreaking as these set of practices. There are all these boxes and ways to screw the Bell system, so on and so forth, with the substantive critiques of the Bell system at the time as basically basically the paradigmatic example of American monopoly capitalism on the one hand, and also an arm of the federal government effectively as a sort of sanctioned monopoly, going back to the Kingsbury Commitment in the early 20th century, which made it sort of the universal telephone service provider, and as sort of that public monopoly. Basically deeply embroiled in an institution deeply embroiled in the sort of travesties of that era. So a telephone tax at the time, there's some figures on this that could be interesting, but a telephone excise tax was used to support the Vietnam War. And so Ma Bell, in some explicit ways like that, was tied to what people on the left saw as some of America's greatest evil doings in the world. And then in more subtle and perhaps interesting ways from a historian's perspective, it's implicated too. And that's the manufacturing and the research divisions, which are part of the Bell system. And so the research division is doing a number of research projects from basically in Cold War America, but going back to World War II, deeply tied to the military industrial complex. Here you can think of Margaret O'Mara's Cities of Knowledge, Bill Leslie's work, a ton of interesting STS work on this sort of relationships here. And then Western Electric was manufacturing weapons and weapon systems and communication systems, which were sometimes, at play in the field of battle, and sometimes casting a very nasty shadow at home. Not Bell Labs, Western Electric was manufacturing parts of nuclear weapons, right? Which were being stored at places like Sandia Labs, right, in the Southwest. And these connections were, as historians, we kind of assume that we see them in retrospect with a clarity that actors at the time couldn't have seen them. But the activists and folks on the left at this period, maybe not to the same degree, they understood these connections between the business of telephony in mid-century America and the research and development and production of technology that was enmeshed in thornier and trickier conflicts and issues at the time. There are other reasons that Bell was opposed to. I mean, one of them being that it was perhaps like the American corporation, right? Bell was the picture of conformity in the 50s and 60s with maybe a few car companies, and certainly IBM, right? Big Blue, where you have great YouTube videos. If any listeners are interested, you can look up men wearing the same suit and tie talking about singing jingles, right, about being IBM men. And so this, for people on the left, in conjunction with these more substantive critiques of the system and its ties to world events, and certainly domestic politics too, this kind of left Bell in a position as sort of a symbol, even as the system.
Mhm.
The Bell system was not just sort of the body electric for American empire, connecting commands between various posts. It was the embodiment, arguably, of all these forces. And so that is where phone phreaking in large part begins. That political commitment, that political critique, doesn't necessarily stay with phone phreaking, and certainly not computer hackers in the decades that would follow. So it's a political origin story that fades with time.
Yeah, so how did your hackers move from a position of opposition to the system to one presumes a desire to operate and be in control of the system, given that that's where many of them ended up?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of explanations we could point to. Some of them are as simple, and historians like to find fancier explanations than this, but people grow up, and they have a family, and they need to earn money to support that family. And in no small part, the people I'm looking at in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, these are teenage men, maybe in their early 20s, maybe college students. There's certainly a great number of women involved throughout, but it's kind of a masculine subculture. And it's certainly the case that when these folks graduate high school, they get a job, they graduate college, they get a job, their day-to-day activities change, their risk tolerance changes, right? So this is a huge, I think and I make this point in the work, can't be understated, the fact of cohorts aging, right? And their viewpoints and politics changing as they age. But there are more interesting and more perhaps compelling historical business history of technology explanations. Some of them are that what hackers presented, one of them that I find compelling, is that hackers represented a new type of expertise, a type of expertise, perhaps even a type of a proto-professional that corporations and maybe even law enforcement agencies or other federal agencies, that they themselves hadn't yet come to possess. And so you have this disjuncture between organizations, be it the FBI or the NSA, maybe corporations like IBM or MCI, whose papers I was looking at Hagley, who are deeply enmeshed in the technological systems of their time. They're creating it, they're policing it, they're monitoring it, and yet they lack, in some ways, the sort of organic expertise required to do that monitoring, do that survey, to engage in that surveillance, to keep the system secure in some way, their own system secure in some ways. And so as computer professionals kind of emerged, especially by the late 60s, Nathan Ensmenger's work on this is great, as they kind of become a force on the American professional scene by the early 70s. Sure, there are university programs at work training folks in computer programming, computer engineering, computer security. But there's also this insurgent set of organic experts who have come up through experimentation in an extremely decentralized set of communities and institutions, hacker communities and institutions. And so there's this sort of deep imbalance, which leads, and this is somewhat well documented, it's something my work's contributing to as well. This leads by the late 80s and early 90s to these institutions that need new experts hiring from these pools of like erstwhile experts or this pool of unexpected expertise, right? So yes, the university programs and training programs, sort of sanctioned professional organs, are at work training and preparing sort of stamped and credentialed professionals. But there's a very strong overlap between that community and the sort of computer underground. And so there's this expertise and professionalism argument, which I think is both business history and history of science and technology. And that's to me, that's very compelling. That's kind of one of the thrusts of the later chapters of the dissertation. And there are other, arguments and explanations for why hackers move across the system in the way they do. One of them would be that the legal repercussions change. In the early 80s, this is before the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. In the mid 80s, there's really no, I mean, there's wire fraud, right? There are very vague and kind of poorly applied statutes in American law that can be used to discipline telephone hackers, phone phreakers, or computer hackers. That just begins to change in the late 80s. The regulatory environment changes. It becomes a little bit more punitive, certainly not as punitive as, sort of the real crackdown on crime that would happen in the 90s. So it's interesting. You look at hacker communities complaining about a hacker crackdown in the 1990s at the exact moment when there's actually a real crackdown happening in especially America's urban centers. So there's definitely a disjuncture in enforcement between sort of, let's say like young Black Americans involved in whatever they're involved in getting policed at sort of disproportionate rates, and hackers doing actual, oftentimes perhaps even more damaging things through computers and telephones, getting like slaps on the wrist, right? I mean, so there's definitely a racialized component to policing and punishment in this period. So that's changing. In the same time, you have officials in sort of America's political landscape, beginning with Reagan in some ways, kind of get clued in to this new risk of cybersecurity and this new sort of vulnerability potentially of American systems in an increasingly global age, right? Words like cyber terrorism and phrases like cyber Pearl Harbor begin to kind of float around. And so you have increased attention on cybersecurity, computer security, from officials and scrutiny from officials that are kind of worried about like international conflict, right? And espionage, which is not very common, right? As far as we can tell from the historical record. It's certainly not something hackers are engaged in very often in the late 80s and 90s, but it's something that officials worry they're engaged in, right? So there's a number of things that kind of lead the hackers to, many sort of first and second generation hackers, to kind of, go straight, as it were, or become white hat hackers, as people would discuss later in the 90s. Some people would describe it as selling out, but others would describe it maybe as getting smart and joining sort of a professional organizational body. So those are a few of the explanations that kind of move us through the 80s and 90s into this weird moment in the 2000s and 2010s when we still have hackers among us, but they're whistleblowers, or they're running hackathons for undergraduates at Brown or something like that, right? So very weird set of hacker practices in the world today, very different from what we saw in the 70s and 80s.
I'm wondering what materials at the Hagley Library you dug into to help you uncover this. You've mentioned the MCI collection.
Yeah. So there are quite a few. There are in the MCI collection a few files um, from its chief technology officer, I believe, at one point, and executive correspondence about hackers basically publicizing MCI telephone numbers and credit card numbers, and publicizing exploits for MCI systems. And then there's great correspondence between the executives basically dismissing it and telling the lawyers to take it up right away, which is interesting because it shows that, for as interesting as we might think hackers would have been to companies, it's kind of a counterpoint. It shows that executives are busy, and their knee-jerk reaction was to really be like, yeah, give this to Bob and let him take them to court. Like, move on. What's the next subject? Right. So there was an interesting set of exchanges in the MCI records there, to show basically the mundanity of cybersecurity in some ways. And that helps us explain why I think it took firms a long time to really beef it in public and private firms to beef up their, like, computer security operations. It was just one of many issues for executives upon whom the ultimate decision to fund those departments rested, right? And so you see interesting disjunctures there. The chief technology officer and a few others also participated in a very important presidential commission on telecommunications security. And for that reason, the complete records of meetings from that commission are in the MCI collection. From the dust on the boxes, I don't know if they've been looked at before, but I certainly had a great time looking at them. And what I'm looking at in those papers, what I'm looking for in those papers, is a sense, an understanding of how this is an industry commission, right? So they're like 200 members of meeting, I think, monthly at various points, sometimes, in subcommittees of the commission more regularly. It's called NSAC, NTSAC, I think, National Telecommunications Advisory Commission or something like that. And these are people from IBM. They're from all the big telecom companies. They're from a number of different federal agencies. And it's really only in the late 80s when they begin to talk about the hacker problem. So because this is such a pivotal sort of policy recommending organization, kind of expert organ, right? It gives us a sense of the time lag between when hackers really kind of came onto the scene in 1984, 1985, and when sort of let's take this as a proxy for just like the American state, right? Not a specialized corner like the NSA, which is probably aware of this issue a little earlier. Maybe not. They were notorious for kind of taking computer security as a backwater issue. But this let's take this as sort of because it's a body of representatives from 200 other organizations, it's kind of an interesting proxy. And they really only begin to discuss the issue in the late 80s. And even then, the first way in which they discuss the issue is with reference to survivability, which is this Cold War mandate to keep telecommunications channels for the executives of America's military and federal and state governments in communication in the case of nuclear war. So the number one concern that this committee has at the beginning with hackers is, are they messing with the sort of private telephone and telecommunications channels, which gosh darn it, we need in the event of Soviet, nuclear attack, right? And so there's a piece I want to write separate from the dissertation on, I think I'll title it something like The Strange Death of Old Security Paradigms or something like that, right? Which will look at how this commission of people plugged in theory, basically couldn't let go of this Cold War mandate, even as it was clear the Soviet Union was faltering, and even as hackers began to present this novel, much more domestic and chaotic type of security threat, not necessarily an organized sort of cyber terrorist threat, as some of the political and corporate actors at the time wanted to style it. And so, that's some of the stuff I'm looking at. There were others, a few collections from IBM Studies and Professionalism. Hagley has such a rich range of sources that I ended up pulling, as is the case, I think, with many historians, like random boxes from random collections based on search terms. But it was really that MCI collection that was key for me, and I'll be coming back within the next few months to look at it a little bit more closely as well.
No, that's great. It's a really exciting project, Jacob.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure. And thank you for taking the time to share it with us. For the
Thank you.
audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's hagley.org. Don't be a stranger.